Hello, everyone. Hello. I missed you all oh so much. It is so nice to see everyone again. Hi, Ash. Hello, Itsi. Thank you for joining. I've missed this. You have no idea. I was lying in bed. Oh, hey, Jay. I'm feeling a lot better. I'm still, once again, not perfect, as this has been a brutal illness that continues to wrap its cold hands around my poor throat. You can actually probably hear it a little bit. I always have a degree of vocal fry, but it's a little more severe today. Missed it too, Ash. Yeah. But yeah, the vocal fry is just slightly more intense. So I ask your patience, understanding. I swear I'm feeling better than I sound. No, I don't need to be bullied more. I need to be bullied less. Where's the sentiment coming from? So yes, if anyone read the description, which I don't think anyone ever does, we will be reading 2 stories today. Well, I will be reading 2 stories, and you will be, I guess, listening to me read them. It's not going to be a very exciting stream. I'm sorry if that's what you were tuning in for. Oh, thank you, Ash. And thank you, Shardiums. I am up for it. I'm up for these 2. Oh, The Outsider. Yes, I will be reading both The Outsider and Count Magnus. Count Magnus by M.R. James, and The Outsider by none other than the very famous H.P. Lovecraft. Oh, hi, well. I am feeling better. Thank you for coming by. Thank you. Oh, so many people here. I'm actually so glad. I was worried no one would be interested in just a reading stream, but it is horror themed and it is the spooky months, so I thought it would be, you know, a fun time. Not necessarily the ghost stories, I promised, but I'm kind of still collecting a few of those and hopefully saving them for sometime closer to Halloween. I do want to do more of these reading streams if people like them, just because I did a practice run through and I actually had a lot of fun, just a lot of fun, reading these aloud. I didn't stress my voice out too much, and no, not The Outsiders. Sorry, I have tea on hand to soothe my poor throat. It's true. She was the only one streaming yesterday, and she was already saying she was in charge. But anyways, I'd like to show you all a place. Would you like to see it? It's a place very special to me. I have this little campsite I keep in the backyard. Far, far in the backyard. From where anyone can see. Here, let's head there now. Wow, that was quick. Not as far in the backyard as I thought. Sorry, I entertain myself probably more than I entertain everyone else. Wow, chat is hard to read on that book. Well, that's fine. Yes, a quick teleportation. Toast your marshmallows, turn off your lights, curl up, and join me as we sit by the crackling campfire for some spooky stories. I think perhaps just due to its tone and writing style, we'll start with Count Magnus. Now, the downside of this is I'll be very focused on the book itself, so I will have less time to look at chat, but I promise to look up when I can. But for the most part, this will be a read-through. But please still leave chats, because I promise I will look back, and as you all make fun of me and laugh and enjoy, reading the chats back later will make my day. Like, I really do enjoy them. Okay. Is everyone all curled up? Ready for our first tale? Okay. Then let's begin. Count Magnus by M.R. James. By what means the papers out of which I have made a connected story came into my hands is the last point the reader will learn from these pages. But it is necessary to prefix to my extracts from all of them a statement of form in which I possess them. They consist then, partly, of a series of collections for a book of travels. Such a volume was a common product of the 40s and 50s. Horace Marryat's Journal of a Residence in Jutland and the Danish Isles is a fair specimen of the class to which I allude. These books usually treated of some unknown district on the continent. They were illustrated with woodcuts or steel plates. They gave details of hotel accommodations and of means of communications, such as we now expect to find in any well-regulated guidebook. And they dealt largely in reported conversations with intelligent foreigners, racy innkeepers, and garrulous peasants. In a word, they were chatty. Begun with the idea of furnishing material for such a book, my papers, as they progressed, assumed the character of a record of one single personal experience, and this record was continued up to the very eve, almost, of its termination. The writer was a Mr. Wraxall. For my knowledge of him, I have to depend entirely on the evidence his writings afford, and from these I deduce that he was a man, past middle age, possessed of some private means, and very much alone in the world. He had, it seems, no settled abode in England, but was a denizen of hotels and boarding houses. It is probable that he entertained the idea of settling down at some future time which never came. And I think it also likely that the Pantechon fire in the early 70s must have destroyed a great deal that would have thrown light on his antecedents. For he refers once or twice to property of his that was warehoused at that establishment. It is further apparent that Mr. Wraxall had published a book, and that it treated of a holiday he had once taken in Brittany. More than this I cannot say about his work, because a diligent search in bibliography works has convinced me that it must have appeared either anonymously or under a pseudonym. As to his character, it's not difficult to form some superficial opinion. He must have been an intelligent and cultivated man. It seems that he was near being a fellow of his college at Oxford, Brasenose. As I judge from the calendar, his besetting fault was pretty clearly that of over-inquisitiveness, possibly a good fault in a traveler, certainly a fault for which this traveler paid dearly enough in the end. On what proved to be his last expedition, he was plotting another book. Scandinavia, a region widely known to Englishmen 40 years ago, had struck him as an interesting field. He must have alighted on some old books of Swedish history or memoirs, and the idea had struck him that there was room for a book descriptive of travel in Sweden, interspersed with episodes from the history of some of the great Swedish families. He procured letters of introduction, therefore, to some persons of quality in Sweden, and set out thither in the summer of 1863. Of his travels in the north there is no need to speak, nor of his residence in some weeks in Stockholm. I need only mention that some savant resident there put him on the track of an important collection of family papers belonging to the proprietors of an ancient manor house in Västergötland, and obtained for him permission to examine them. The house, or herrgård, in question, and once again I actually want to pause here to say I apologize if my pronunciation is not on the ball. I tried to look up as many of these words as possible, but I'm still a very flawed, invisible human being. Anyways, let's go back into the book. The manor house, or herrgård in question, is to be called Roback, though that is not its name. It is one of the best buildings of its kind in the country, and the picture of it in Dallenberg's Suecia Antiqua e Moderna, engraved in 1694, shows it very much as the tourist may see it today. It was built soon after 1600, and is roughly speaking very much like an English house of that period in respect of material. Red brick with stone facings, and style. The man who built it was a scion of the great house of De la Guardia, and his descendants possess it still. De la Guardia is the name by which I will designate them when mention of them becomes necessary. They receive Mr. Wraxall with great kindness. Oh wait. Oh, thank you all. I'm glad you're having fun thus far. They receive Mr. Wraxall with great kindness and courtesy, and pressed him to stay in the house as long as his research lasted, but preferring to be independent and mistrusting his powers of conversing in Swedish, he settled himself at the village inn, which turned out to be quite sufficiently comfortable, at any rate during the summer months. This arrangement would entail a short walk daily to and from the manor house, of something under a mile. The house itself stood in a park, and was protected, we should say grown up, with large old timber. Near it, you found the walled gardens, and then entered a closed wood fringing one of the small lakes with which the country is pitted. Then came the wall of the Demay, and you climbed a steep knoll, a knob of rock lightly covered with soil, and on the top of this stood the church, fenced with dark trees. It was a curious building to English eyes. The nave and aisles were low, and filled with pews and galleries. In the western galley stood the handsome old organ, gaily painted with silver pipes. The ceiling was flat and had been adorned by 17th century artists with a strange and hideous Last Judgment full of lurid flames, falling cities, burning ships, crying souls, and brown and smiling demons. Handsome brass coronae hung from the roof. The pulpit was like a doll's house covered with little painted wood cherubs and saints. A stand with 3 hourglasses was hinged to the preacher's desk. Such sights as these may be seen in many a church in Sweden now. But what distinguished this one was an addition to the original building. At the eastern end of the northern aisle, the builder of the manor house had erected a mausoleum for himself and his family. It was a largish, 8-sided building lighted by a series of oval windows, and it had a dome roof topped by some kind of a pumpkin-shaped object rising into a spire, a form which Swedish architects greatly delighted. The roof was of copper externally and was painted black, while the walls, in common with those of the church, were staringly white. To this mausoleum there was no access from the church. It had a portal and steps of its own on the northern side. Past the churchyard, path to the village goes, and not more than 3 or 4 minutes brings you to the inn door. On the first day of his stay at Robeck, Mr. Raxel found the church door open and made these notes of the interior, which I have epitomized into the mausoleum. He could not make his way. He could, by looking through the keyhole, just descry that there were fine marble effigies and sarcophagi of copper and a wealth of armorial ornament, which made him very anxious to spend some time in investigation. The papers had come to examine at the manor house proved to be just the kind he wanted for his book. There were family correspondence journals and account books of the earliest owners of the estate, very carefully kept and clearly written, full of amusing and picturesque detail. The first De la Guardia appeared in them as a strong and capable man. Shortly after the building of the mansion, then there had been a period of distress in the district, and the peasants had risen and attacked several chateaux and done some damage. The owner of Roback took a leading part in suppressing troubles, and there was reference to executions of ringleaders and severe punishments inflicted with no sparing hand. The portrait of this Magnus de la Gardie was one of the best in the house, and Mr. Raxel studied it with no little interest after his day's work. He gave no detailed description of it, but I gather that the face impressed him, rather by its power than by its beauty or goodness. In fact, he writes that Count Magnus was almost a phenomenally ugly man. On this day, Mr. Raxel took his supper with the family and walked back in late but still bright evening. I must remember, he he writes, to ask the sexton if he can let me into the mausoleum at the church. He evidently has access to it himself, for I saw him tonight standing on the steps, and as I thought, locking or unlocking the door. I find that early on the following day, Mr. Axel had some conversation with his landlord. Setting it down at such length as he does surprised me at first, but I soon realized that the papers I was reading were, at least in their beginning, the materials for the book. He was meditating, and that it was to have been one of those quasi-journalistic productions which admit introduction of an admixture of a conversational manner. Sorry, something caught in my throat there. His object, he says, was to find whether any traditions of Count Magnus de la Gardie lingered on in the senses of that gentleman's activity, and whether the popular estimate of him were favorable or not. He found that the Count was decidedly not a favorite. If his tenants came in late to their work on the days which they owed him as lord of the manor, they were set on the wooden horse, or flogged and branded in the manor house yard. One or two cases there were of men who had occupied lands which approached the lord's dominion, and whose houses had been mysteriously burned on a winter's night, with the families inside. But what seems to dwell on the innkeeper's mind most, for he returned to the subject more than once, was that the Count had been on the Black Pilgrimage, and had brought something, or someone, back with him. You will naturally inquire, as Mr. Raxel did, what the Black Pilgrimage may have been. But your curiosity on the point must remain unsatisfied for the time being, just as his did. The landlord was evidently unwilling to give a full answer, or indeed any answer on the point, and being called out for a moment, trotted out with obvious elicitory, only putting his head at the door a few minutes afterwards to say that he had been called away to Skara and should not be back till evening. Do you hear that? Sounds like someone's nearby. This isn't part of the book. I'm just hearing. Oh, sounds like they left. Shall we get back? So, Mr. Raxel had to go unsatisfied to his day's work at the manor house. The papers on which he was just then engaged soon put his thoughts into another channel, for he had to occupy himself with glancing over the correspondence between Sophia Albertina in Stockholm and her married cousin, Ulrika Leonora, in Robak in the years 1705 to 1710. The letters were of exceptional interest from the light they threw upon the culture of that period in Sweden, as anyone can testify who has read the full edition of them in the publication of the Swedish Historical Manuscripts Commission. In the afternoon he had done with these, and after returning the boxes in which they were kept to their places on the shelf, he proceeded very naturally to take down some of the volumes nearest to them, in order to determine which of them had best be his principal subject of investigation the next day. The shelf he had hit was occupied mostly by a collection of account books in the writing of the first Count Magnus, but among them was not an account book, but a book of alchemical and other tracts in another 16th century hand. Not being very familiar with alchemical literature, Mr. Raxel spends much space which he might have spared in setting out the names and beginnings of the various treatises. The Book of the Phoenix, Book of 30 Words, Book of the Toad, Book of Miriam, Turba Philosophorum, and so forth. Then he announces with a good deal of circumstance his delight at finding, on a leaf, originally left blank near the middle of the book, some writing of Count Magnus himself, headed Liber Nigre peregrinationes. It is true that only a few lines were written, but there was quite enough to show that the landlord had, that morning, been referring to a belief at least as old as time. As the time of Count Magnus, and probably shared by him. This is the English of what was written. If any man desires to obtain a long life, he would obtain a faithful messenger and see the blood of his enemies. It is necessary that he should first go into the city of Chorazin and there salute the prince. Here there was an eraser of one word, though not very thoroughly done, so that Mr. Wraxall felt pretty sure that he was right in reading it as heiress of the heir. There was no more of the text copied, only a line in Latin. Quare reliqua hujus materia inter secretiora. See the rest of this matter among the more private things, would be what that meant. It could not be denied that this threw a rather lurid light upon the tastes and beliefs of the Count. But to Mr. Wraxall, separated from him by nearly 3 centuries, the thought that he might have added to his general forcefulness, alchemy, and to alchemy something like magic, only made a more picturesque figure. And when, after a rather prolonged contemplation of this picture in the hall, Mr. Wraxall set out on his homeward way, his mind was full of the thought of Count Magnus. He had no eyes for his surroundings, no perception of the evening scents of the woods, or the evening light on the lake. And when all of a sudden he pulled up short, he was astonished to find himself already at the gate of the churchyard. And within a few minutes of his dinner, his eyes fell on the mausoleum. "Ah," he said. "Count Magnus, there you are. I should dearly like to see you." "Like many solitary men," he writes, "I have a habit of talking to myself aloud. And unlike some of the Greek and Latin particles, I do not expect an answer. Certainly, and perhaps fortunately in this case, there was neither voice, nor any that regarded. Only the woman who, I suppose, was clearing up the church, dropped some metallic object on the floor, whose clang startled me. Count Magnus, I think, sleeps sound enough." That same evening, the landlord of the inn, who had heard Mr. Wraxall say that he wished to see the clerk, or deacon, as he would be called in Sweden, of the parish, introduced him to that official in the inn parlor. A visit to the De la Gardie tomb house was soon arranged the next day, and a little general conversation ensued. Mr. Wraxall, remembering that one function of Scandinavian deacons is to teach candidates for confession, thought he would refresh his own memory on a biblical point. "Can you tell me," he said, "anything about Chorazin?" The deacon seemed startled, but readily reminded him how that village had once been denounced. "To be sure," said Mr. Wraxall. "It is, I suppose, quite a ruin now." So I expect," replied the deacon. "I have heard some of our old priests say that Antichrist is to be born there, and there are tales—" "Ah, what are those?" Mr. Wraxall put in. "Tales, I was going to say, which I have forgotten," said the deacon, and soon after that he said good night. The landlord was now alone, and at Mr. Wraxall's mercy, that inquirer was inclined to spare him. "Herr Nielsen," he said, "I have found out something about the I have found out something about the Black Pilgrimage. You may as well tell me what you know. What did the Count bring back with him? Swedes are habitually slow people. Perhaps in answering, or perhaps the landlord was an exception. I'm not sure. But Mr. Raxel notes that the landlord spent at least 1 minute looking at him before he said anything at all. And then he came up close to his guest, and with a good deal of effort, he spoke. Mr. Raxel, I can tell you this one little tale, and no more. Not any more. You must not ask anything when I have done. In my grandfather's time, that is 92 years ago, there were 2 men who said the Count is dead. We do not care for him. We will go tonight and have a free hunt in his wood. The long wood on the hill that you have seen behind Roback. Well, those that heard them say this. They said, no, do not go. We are sure you will meet with persons walking who should not be walking. They should be resting, not walking. These men left. They were no forest men to keep the wood, because no one wished to live there. The family were not here at the house. These men could do what they wished. Very well. Go into the woods that night. My grandfather was sitting here in this room. It was the summer and a light night. With the window open, he could see out to the wood and hear. So he sat there, and 2 or 3 men with him, and they listened. At first, they hear nothing at all, and then they hear someone. You know how far away it is. They hear someone scream, just as if the most inside part of his soul was being twisted out of him. All of them caught in the room, hold of each other, and they sat for 3/4 of an hour. And then they hear someone else. Only about 300 ells off. They hear him laugh out loud. It was not one of those 2 men that laughed, and indeed, they have all of them said it was not any man at all. After that, they hear the great doors shut. Then, when it was just the light of the sun, they all went to the priest. They said to him, Father, put on your gown and your ruff and come to bury these men, Anders Bjornsson and Hans Torbjorn. You understand, they were sure these men were dead. So they went to the wood. My grandfather never forgot this. He said they were all like many dead men themselves. The priest, too, he was white in fear. He said when they came to him, I heard one cry in the night and one laugh afterwards. If I cannot forget that, I shall not be able to sleep again. So they went to the wood, and they found these men on the edge of the wood. Hans Torbjorn was standing with his back against a tree, and all of the time he was pushing his hands, pushing something away from him, something which was not there. So he was not dead, and they led him away and took him to the house at Nyköping, and he died before the winter, but he went on pushing with his hands. Also, Anders Bjornsson was there, but he was dead. And I tell you this about Anders Bjornsson. He was once a beautiful man, but now his face was not there, because the flesh of it was sucked away off the bones. You understand that? My grandfather did not forget that. And they laid him on the bier which they brought, and put a cloth over his head, and the priest walked before. And they began to sing the song of the dead as well as they could. And so they were singing the end of the first verse. One fell down who was carrying The head of the bier and the others looked back, and they saw that the cloth had fallen off, and the eyes of Anders Bjornsson were looking up because there was nothing to close them. And this they could not bear. Therefore the priest laid the cloth upon him and sent for a spade, and they buried him in that place. The next day, Mr. Raxel records that the deacon called for him soon after his breakfast and took him to the church and mausoleum. He noticed that the key of the ladder was hung on a nail just by the pulpit. It occurred to him that, as the church doors seemed to be left unlocked as a rule, it would not be difficult for him to pay a second and more private visit to the monuments if there proved to be more of interest among them than could be digested at first. The building, when he entered it, he found not unimposing. The monuments, mostly large erections of the 17th and 18th century, were dignified if luxuriant, and the epitaphs and heraldry were copious. The central space of that domed room was occupied by 3 copper sarcophagi covered with finely engraved ornament. 2 of them had, as is common in the case of Denmark and Sweden, a large metal crucifix on the lid. The third, that of Count Magnus, as it appeared, had instead of that a full-length effigy engraved upon it, and round the edges were several bands of similar ornament representing various scenes. One was a battle with cannon belching out smoke in walled towns and troops of pikemen. Another showed an execution. In a third, among trees, was a man running at full speed, with hair in outstretched hands. After him followed a strange form. It would be hard to say whether the artist intended it for a man and was unable to give the requisite similitude of whether it was intentionally made as monstrous as it looked, in the view of skill with which the drawing was done. Mr. Raxel felt inclined to adopt the latter idea. The figure was unduly short, and was for the most part muffed in a hooded garment which swept the ground. The only part of the form which projected from that shelter was not shaped like any hand or arm. Mr. Raxel compares it to the tentacle of a devilfish, and continues. On seeing this, I said to myself, this, then, which is evidently allegorical representation of some kind. A fiend pursuing a hunted soul. Maybe the origin of the story of Count Magnus and his mysterious companion. Let us see how the huntsman is pictured. Doubtless it will be a demon blowing its horn. But, as it turns out, there was no such sensational figure. Only the semblance of a cloaked man on a hillock, who stood leaning on a stick, watching the hunt with an interest which the engraver had tried to express in his attitude. Mr. Raxel noted that the finely worked and massive steel padlocks, 3 in number, which secured the sarcophagus. One of them, he saw, was detached and lay on the pavement. And then, unwilling to delay the deacon longer, or waste his own working time, he made his way onward to the manor house. It's curious, he notes, how on retracing a familiar path, one's thoughts engross one to the absolute exclusion of surrounding objects. Tonight, for the second time, I entirely failed to notice where I was going. I'd planned a private visit to the tomb house to copy the epitaphs, when I suddenly, as it were, awoke to consciousness and found myself, as before, turning in at the churchyard gate. And I believe singing or chanting some words. Are you awake, Count Magnus? Are you asleep, Count Magnus? And then something more which I have failed to recollect. It seems to me I must have been behaving in this nonsensical way for some time. He found the key of the mausoleum where he had expected to find it, and copied the greater part of it. Of what he wanted, in fact, he stayed until the light began to fail him. I must have been wrong, he writes, in saying that one of the padlocks of my Count's sarcophagus was unfastened. I see tonight that two are loose. I picked both up and laid them carefully on the window ledge, after trying unsuccessfully to close them. The remaining one is still firm, and though I take it to be a spring lock, I cannot guess how it is opened. Had I succeeded in undoing it, I am almost afraid I should have taken the liberty of opening the sarcophagus. It is strange, the interest I feel in the personality of this, I fear, somewhat ferocious and grim old noble. The following day was, as it turns out, the last of Mr. Raxel's stay at Robeck. He received letters connected with certain investments, which made it desirable that he should return to England. His work among the papers was practically done, and traveling was slow. He decided, therefore, to make his farewells, and putting some finishing touches to his notes, and be off. These finishing touches and farewells, as it turns out, took more time than he had expected. The hospitable family insisted on his staying to dine with them. They dined at 3, and it was verging on 6:30 before he was outside the iron gates of Robeck. He dwelt on every step of his walk by the lake, determined to saturate himself now that he trod it for the last time, and in the sentiment of the place of hour. In the sentiment of the place and hour. And when he reached the summit of the churchyard knoll, he lingered for many minutes, gazing at the limitless prospect of the woods, near and distant, all dark beneath a sky of liquid green. When at last he turned to go, the thought struck him that surely he must bid farewell to Count Magnus, as well as the rest of the De la Gardie. The church was but 20 yards away, and he knew where the key of the mausoleum hung. It was not long before he was standing over the great copper coffin, and as usual, talking to himself aloud. You may have been a bit of a rascal in your time, Magnus, he was saying. But for all that, I should like to see you, or rather, just in that instant, he says, I felt a blow on my foot. Hastily enough, I drew it back, and something fell on the pavement with a clash. It was the third and last of the 3 padlocks which had fastened the sarcophagus. I stooped to pick it up, and heavens is my witness that I am writing only the bare truth. Before I had raised myself, there was a sound of metal hinges creaking, and I distinctly saw the lid shifting upward. I may have behaved like a coward, but I could not, for my life, stay for one moment. I was outside that dreadful building in less time than I can write, almost as quickly as I could have said the words. And what frightens me more, I could not turn the key in the lock. As I sit here in my room noting these facts, I ask myself, it was not 20 minutes ago, whether the noise of that creaking metal continued. I cannot tell whether it did or not. I only know that there was something more. And I have written that alarmed me. But whether it was sound or sight, I am not able to remember. What is it that I have done? Poor Mr. Raxel He set out on his journey to England on the next day as he had planned, and he reached England in safety. And yet, as I gather from his changed hand and inconsequent jottings, a broken man. One of the several small notebooks that have come to me with his papers gives me not a key, but a small kind of inkling of his experiences. Much of his journey was made by canal boat, and I find not less than 6 passages. 6 painful attempts to enumerate and describe his fellow passengers. The entries are of this kind. 24. Pastor of the village in Skane. Usual black cloak and soft black hat. Commercial traveler from Stockholm going to Trollhättan. Black cloak, brown hat. Man in long black cloak, broad leafed hat. Very old-fashioned. This entry is lined out, and a note added, perhaps identical with number 13. Have not yet seen his face. On referring to number 13, I find he is a Romanian priest in a cassock. The net result of this reckoning is always the same. 28 people appear in the enumeration, one always being a man in a long black cloak and broad hat, and another a short figure in dark cloak and hood. On the other hand, it's always noted that only 26 passengers appear at meals, and that the man in the cloak is perhaps absent, and the short figure is certainly absent. On reaching England, it appears that Mr. Wraxall landed at Harwich, and that he resolved at once to put himself out of reach of some person or persons whom he never specifies, but whom he evidently had come to regard as his pursuers. Accordingly, he took a vehicle. It was a closed fly, not trusting the railway, and drove across the country to the village of Belchamp St. Paul. It was about 9 o'clock on a moonlit August night when he neared the place. He was sitting forward and looking out of the window at the fields and thickets. There was little else to be seen racing past him. Suddenly, he came to a crossroad. At the corner, 2 figures were standing motionless. Both were in dark cloaks. The taller one wore a hat. The shorter, a hood. He had no time to see their faces, nor did they make any motion that he could discern. Yet the horse sheed violently and broke into a gallop. Mr. Wraxall sank back into his seat in something like a desperation. He had seen them before. Oh, that's fine, Highwell. I hope you enjoyed the story. Thank you for coming, and I hope to see you again sometime. Back to the story now. Arriving at Belchamp St. Paul, he was fortunate enough to find a decent furnished lodging, and for the next 24 hours, he lived, comparatively speaking, in peace. His last notes were written on this day. They are too disjointed and ejaculatory to be given here in full, but the substance of them is clear enough. He's expecting a visit from his pursuers. How or when, he knows not. And his constant cry is, what has he done? Is the end? Is there no hope? Doctors, he knows, would call him mad. Policemen would laugh at him. The parson is away. What can he do but lock his door and cry to God? People still remember last year at Belchamp St. Paul, how a strange gentleman came one evening in August, years back, and how the next morning but one was found dead. And there was an inquest, and the jury that viewed the body fainted. 7 of them did. None of them would even speak to what they see. And the verdict was a visitation of God. And how the people, as kept the house, moved out the same week and went away from that part. They do not, I think, know that any glimmer of light has ever been thrown, or could be thrown on the mystery. It so happened last year that that little house came into my hands as part of a legacy. It has stood empty since 1863, and there seemed no prospect of letting it. So I had it pulled down, and the papers of which I have given you an abstract were found, forgotten, in the cupboard, under a window, in the best bedroom. And that is the end of that tale. How did everyone enjoy our first story of the night? Oh wow, that went on so long. Thank you to everyone who listened for that. I guess I'm a slow reader. My previous times came out so much shorter. Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed Shade Sable. You think I'd be better at pronouncing people's names after reading that much? Oh, let me read up in chat now. I feel like I owe you guys that. Thank you. Oh, why can't I scroll? There we go. Caecus has such a good voice. Oh, thank you, thank you. Thank you. Oh, just so many compliments. I actually would love to do, like, much more classic, like, less scary, read bedtime stories for you all. Like, that's actually something I'd like to do after Halloween. I want to keep doing these read-alongs because I have so much fun doing them. Just genuinely so much fun. Yes, I am very pleased with the sound effects. I like how they add a lot of atmosphere. Ooh, I love the 3-lock part. How they just, the narrator themselves seems to be losing their own perception. Do you think, now I tried to read it in a way where it was almost either read by a very cruel person or by Magnus himself. And that was how I imagined the character. I don't know if that came across. I hope it did. That was my intention. It's not perfect, as it's kind of, you know, live. But yes, that was my intention. Thank you. I was wondering if people would like those. I'm like, I know people like how I sound as I am, and I don't know if people would like if I sound different, but I chose to move my voice around. I'd like to read like more like that. But this next story is actually read in one solitary voice, and it's H.P. Lovecraft. Yes, so I think we should get on to that before the stream goes on too long, and I keep you all up far too late. Or perhaps the scary stories are keeping you up. I can raise my glasses quite playfully. Shall we get to it? I'm also going to have some of this tea that is very cold by now. Yes, good. That is soothing to the throat. A little bit more. My apologies. Well, I'm glad you're ready for the next terrifying tale. The Outsider by H.P. Lovecraft. Unhappy is he to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. Wretched is he who looks back upon lone hours in vast and dismal chambers, with brown hangings and maddening rows of antique books, or upon odd watches in the twilight groves of grotesque, gigantic, and vine-encumbered trees that silently wave twisted branches far aloft. Such a lot of the gods gave to me. To me, the dazed and disappointed, the barren, the broken, and yet I am strangely content and cling desperately to those sear memories. When my mind momentarily threatens to reach beyond the other. I know not where I was born, save that the castle was infinitely old and infinitely horrible. Full of dark passages and having high ceilings, where the eye could only find cobwebs and shadows. The stones in the crumbling corridors always seemed hideously damp, and there was an accursed smell everywhere. As of the piled up corpses of dead generations, there was never light, so that I sometimes used to light candles and gaze steadily at them for relief. Nor was there any sun outdoors, since the terrible trees grew high above the topmost accessible tower. There was one black tower, which reached above the trees, into the unknown outer sky, but that was partially ruined, and could not be ascended save by a well-nigh impossible climb up the sheer wall, stone by stone. I must have lived for years in this place, but I cannot measure the time. Beings must have cared for my needs, yet I cannot recall any person except for myself, or anything alive but the noiseless rats, bats, and spiders. Oh hey, Itzi's here. No, Itzi's very noisy. I think that whoever nursed me must have been shockingly aged, since my first conception of a living person was that of something mockingly like myself, yet distorted, shriveled, and decaying like the castle. To me, there was nothing grotesque in the bones and skeletons that strode some of the crypts deep down among the foundations, and I frantically associate these things with everyday events, and thought them more natural than the colored pastures of living beings, which I found in many of the moldy books. From such books I learned all that I know. No teacher urged or guided me. I do not recall hearing any human voice in all these years. Not even my own, for although I had read of speech, I had never thought to try to speak out loud. My aspect was a matter equally unthought of, for there were no mirrors in the castle, and I merely regarded myself, by instinct, as akin to the youthful figures I saw drawn and painted in the books. I felt conscious of youth because I remembered so little. Outside, across the putrid moat, under the dark, muted trees, I would often lie and dream for hours about what I read in the books, and would longingly picture myself amidst gay crowds in the sunny world beyond the endless forest. Once I tried to escape from the forest, but as I went further from the castle, the shade grew denser and the air filled more with brooding fear, so that I ran frantically back lest I lose my way in the labyrinth of nighted silence. So through endless twilights I dreamed and waited, though I knew not what I waited for. Then in the shadowy solitude, my longing for light grew so frantic that I could rest no more. I lifted entreating hands to the single black tower that reached above the forest into the unknown outer sky. And at last, I resolved to scale that tower. Fall though I might, since it were better to glimpse the sky and perish than it were to live without ever beholding day. In the dank twilight, I climbed the worn and aged stone stairs till I reached the level where they ceased, and thereafter clung perilously to small footholds leading upwards. Ghastly and terrible was that dead, stairless cylinder of rock, black, ruined, and deserted, and sinister, with bats startled whose wings made no noise. But more ghastly and terrible was the slowness of my progress. For climb as I might, the darkness overhead grew no thinner, and a new chill, as of haunted and venerable mold, assailed me. I shivered as I wondered why I did not reach the light, and would have to look down had I dared. I fancied that night had come suddenly upon me. I vainly groped with one free hand for a window embracer, that I might peer out and above to try to judge the height I had attained. All at once, after an infinity of awesome, sightless crawling up that concave and desperate precipice, I felt my head touch a solid thing. And I knew I must have gained the roof, or at least some kind of floor in the darkness. I raised my free hand and tested the barrier, finding it in stone immovable. Then came a deadly circuit of the tower, clinging to whatever holds the slimy wall would give, till finally my testing hand found the barrier yield, and I turned upward again, pushing the slab or door with my head as I used both hands in my fearful ascent. There was no light revealed above. As my hands went higher, I knew the climb was for the nonce ended, since the slab was the trapdoor of an aperture leading to a level stone surface of a greater circumference than the lower tower. No doubt the floor of some lofty and capacious observation chamber. I crawled through carefully and tried to prevent the heavy slab from falling back into place, but failed in the later attempt. As I lay exhausted on the stone floor, I heard the echoes of its fall, but hoped, when necessary, to pry it open again. Believing I was now at a prodigious height, far above the accursed branches of the wood, I dragged myself up from the floor and fumbled about for windows, that I might have looked for the first time upon the sky and moon, and stars of which I had read. But every hand I was disappointed, since all that I found were vast shelves of marble bearing odious oblong boxes of disturbing size. More and more I reflected, and wondered what hoary secrets might abide in this high apartment, so many eons cut off from the castle below. Then, unexpectedly, my hands came upon a doorway where hung a portal of stone, rough with strange chiseling. Trying it, I found it locked, but with a supreme burst of strength, I overcame all obstacles and dragged it open inward. As I did so, there came to me the purest ecstasy I have ever known. For shining tranquility, through an ornate grating of iron, and down a short stone passageway of steps that ascended from the newly found doorway, was the radiant, full moon, which I had never before seen save in dreams or vague visions I dare not call memories. Fancying now that I had obtained the very pinnacle of the castle, I commenced to rush up the few steps beyond the door. The sudden veiling of the moon by a cloud caused me to stumble, and I fell my way more slowly in the dark. It was very dark when I reached the grating, when I tried carefully and found it unlocked, but which I did not open, for fear of falling from the amazing height to which I had climbed. Then the moon came out. Most demoniacal of all shocks is that of the abysmally unexpected and grotesquely unbelievable. Nothing I had before undergone could compare in terror with what I now saw. But that bizarre marvels which sight implied. The sight itself was as simple as it was stupefying, for it was merely this. Instead of a dizzying prospect of treetops seen from the lofty eminence, the stretch around me on a level, though the grading nothing less than the solid ground, decked and diversified by marble slabs and columns, overshadowed by an ancient stone church whose ruined spire gleamed spectrally in the moonlight. Half conscious, I opened the grating and staggered upon the white gravel path that stretched away in two directions. My mind, stunned and chaotic as it was, still held the frantic craving for light. Not even the fantastic wonder which had happened could stay my course. I neither knew nor cared whether my experience was insanity, dreaming, or magic, but I was determined to gaze upon brilliance and gaiety at any cost. I knew not who I was, or what my surroundings might be. Though as I continued to stumble along, I became conscious of a kind of fearsome, latent memory that made my progress not wholly fortuitous. I passed under an arch of that region of slabs and columns and wandered through the open country, sometimes following the visible road, but sometimes leaving it curiously to tread along meadows where only occasional ruins bespoke the ancient presence of a forgotten road. Once I swam across a river, where crumbling, mossy masonry told of a bridge long vanished. Over 2 hours must have passed before I reach what seems to be my goal. A veritable, ivied castle in a thickly wooded part, maddeningly familiar, yet full of perplexing strangeness to me. I saw the moat was filled in, and that some of the well-known towers were demolished, whilst new wings existed to confuse the beholder. But what I observed with chief interest and delight were the open windows, gorgeously ablaze with light and sending forth the sound of gayest revelry. Advancing to one of them, I looked in and saw oddly dressed company indeed, making merry, speaking brightly to one another. I had never seemingly heard human speech before, and could guess only vaguely what was said. Some of their faces seemed to hold expressions that brought up incredibly remote recollections. Others were entirely alien. Give me a sec, I need a drink. Thank you. I now stepped through the low window into the brilliant lighted room, stepping as I did so from my single bright moment of hope into my blackest convulsion of despair and realization. The nightmare was quick to come, for as I entered, there occurred immediately one of the most terrifying demonstrations I had ever conceived. Scarcely had I crossed the still where there descended upon the whole company a sudden unheralded fear of hideous intensity, distorting every face and invoking the most horrible screams from nearly every throat. Flight was universal, and in the clamor and panic several fell in a swoon and were dragged away by their madly fleeing companions. Many covered their eyes with their hands and plunged blindly and awkwardly to race their escape, overturning furniture, stumbling against the walls before they managed to reach one of the many doors. The cries were shocking, and as I stood in the brilliant apartment alone and dazed, listening to their vanished echoes, I trembled at the thought of what might be lurking near me unseen. At a casual inspection, the room seemed deserted, but when I moved towards one of the alcoves, I thought I detected a presence there, a hint of motion beyond the golden arched doorway leading to another, somewhat similar room. And as I approached the arch, I began to perceive the presence more clearly. And then, with the first and last sound I ever uttered, a ghastly ululation that revolted me as almost as poignantly as its noxious cause, I beheld in full, frightful vividness the inconceivable, indescribable, unmentionable monstrosity, which had by its simple appearance changed a merry company into a herd of delirious fugitives. I cannot even hint what it was like, for it was a compound of all that was unclean, uncanny, unwelcome, abnormal, and detestable. It was the ghoulish shade of decay, antiquity, and desolation. The putrid, dripping eidolon of unwholesome revelation. The awful barring of that which merciful earth should always hide. God knows it was not of this world, or no longer of this world. Yet to my horror, I saw it in its eaten away and bone-reveling outlines, a leering, abhorrent travesty on the human shape and its moldy, disintegrating apparel, an unspeakable quality that chilled me even more. I was almost paralyzed, but not too much to make a feeble effort towards flight. A backward stumble which failed to break the spell in which the nameless, voiceless monster held me. My eyes bewitched the glassy orbs which stared loathsomely into them, refused to close though they were mercifully blurred, and shrewd the terrible object. But distinct after that first shock, I tried to raise my hand to shut out the sight, yet so stunned were my nerves that my arm could not fully obey my will. The attempt, however, was enough to disturb my balance, so that I had to stagger forward several attempts to avoid falling. As I did, so I became suddenly and agonizingly aware of the nearness of the carrion thing, whose hideous, hollow breathing I half fancied I could hear. Nearly mad, I found myself, yet unable to throw out a hand. To ward off the fetid apparition which pressed so close, when in one cataclysmic second of cosmic nightmarishness, the hellish accident, my fingers touched the rotting, outstretched paw of the monster beneath the golden arch. I did not shriek, but all the fiendish ghouls that night wind shrieked for me, as in that same second there crashed down upon me a single and fleeting avalanche of soul-annihilating memory. I knew in that second all that had been. I remembered the frightful castle in the trees. I recognized the altered edifice in which now I stood. I recognized the most terrible of all, the unholy abomination that stood leering before me as I withdrew my sullied fingers from its own. But in the cosmos there is a balm as well as there is bitterness. Going to ban that fucking bot. My apologies. But in the cosmos there is balm as well as there is bitterness. And that balm is nepenthe. And the supreme horror of that second I forgot what horrified me. And the burst black memory vanished in a chaos of echoing images. In a dream I fled from that haunted and accursed pile and ran swiftly in the moonlight. When I returned to the churchyard, place of marble, and went down the steps, I found the stone trapdoor immovable. But I was not sorry, for I hated the antique castle in the trees. I now ride with mocking and friendly ghouls on the night wind, and play by day amongst the catacombs of Nefrenka, in the sealed and unknown valley of Hodoth by the Nile. I know that light is not for me, save that of the moon over the rock tombs of Neb, nor any gaiety save for the unnamed feasts of Niktokrith beneath the Great Pyramid. Yet, in my new wildness and freedom, I almost welcome the bitterness of alienage. For although the nepenthe has calmed me, I know always that I am an outsider, a stranger in this century, and among those who are still men. This I have known ever since I stretched out to my fingers to the abomination within that great gilded frame. Stretched out my fingers and touched a cold and unyielding surface of polished Alas. And that was The Outsider. I like the ending to that one a lot, even though I think you can kind of see it coming, you know? Thank you, Illumij. Ah, yes, that was a lot of fun. I'm going to do that again. I don't know when. I might do. Would you guys like me to do these every week? Would you continue to come to Friday story time? Would that be of interest to y'all? Oh, I'm glad you liked it, Fred. Because I have a lot of fun doing this, and I want to do ASMR properly. I'm going to get those $1,000 ears on a stick. I just have to raise some funds first. I also, I wanted to get this done, but I didn't know if it suited either one of these, but I guess I could have done it. I want to include sound effects, for moments in the story. It would require a little more setup, but I think it'd be worth it to add that storytelling atmosphere. Like when he talks about moving the slab, you hear like the sound of a slab being like stone against stone, or when the locks fall, you hear them like the tunk. I think that would be very cool. That might take some time to set up, but I have a proper soundboard ready for that. Yes. Yes. Maybe some of those too. Like, I actually do like the idea of just more atmosphere. I want to build the atmosphere more and more until it becomes a much more immersive storytelling experience. That's kind of my favorite kind of thing. Anyways, it's getting a little spooky out here, and I think some figures in the distance are watching us. Perhaps it would be best to return safely back to the Yokast mansion. Let's go. Yes, I noticed those guys floating in the distance at the start, and I didn't want to bring them up because I thought it might scare you all and send you running away. I think they're always there. They're mostly harmless. Most of the time. But yes. I would also at some point like to write my own stories that I read, both spooky and not. I do like anthology media. Oh, you're right. Oh. Come on. Did that get it? It's the sound of the house outside. I just had to close the window. You didn't see my hand do it because, they're invisible. Oh, good, Grimwolf. I'm glad you're still here. I hope that was properly spooky for you all. I want to do this again. I bought a book of classic horror tales for this explicit purpose. This is not a Halloween only thing. I know it's very Halloween-ish to do, but I want to do it outside of Halloween as well. Oh no, it's fine. You don't have to talk a lot. I'm just glad you're still here. But yes, I want to keep doing these because who doesn't like a scary story? And in Halloween, it's only going to be scary, but past that, who knows? I might read Haruki Murakami if that doesn't get me taken off stream. I have to be careful. But I do want to read more classic short stories on stream and do a lot more of that. But yes. I think I've kept you all. Ooh, I would love to do Christmas tales. Oh, 'twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house, not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. See? I can do that. That would be fun. Ah, poetry too, maybe. I don't know. Let's all learn together as we read classic literature. Thank you all for coming. I've been holding off on saying goodbye because I enjoy talking to you all so much. I've missed you all. I can't say that enough. I missed you all so much. And I'm glad to be back. I hope to be back tomorrow. I had this kind of energy. Oh, hi, Toxic. Bye, Toxic. Come, check out the VOD if you didn't listen. I totally lost my train of thought. I felt good when I was talking to Romeo, but I feel better now in general. Although I am tired by the end of this, so it probably is a good time to go to sleep. So I'll say once and for all, it's been so nice to see you all, my lovely spectators. And with that, I say good night. And don't let the bed bugs bite.